So, over the past couple of days, we've been looking at the idea of the definition of extremes in politics and how the basic categorization of left and right and the generalizations that go along with that. Well, what we're going to look at very briefly today is a very super simplified version of two of the men who really form the backbone ideas of what defines left politics and right politics. Now, please keep in mind again, these are very oversimplified generalizations just meant to give us some background information. Not every situation is going to fit perfectly. And also remember that we're discussing objectively what the factual approach is to things, not like what I'm telling you are things that you should believe, but understanding where these trends seem to have come from. So let's start with the left. The sort of Mac Daddy godfather of leftist thinking is generally regarded to be this charming and handsome fellow here, Karl Marx. Karl Marx was a German philosopher, economist, and historian who was hired by a group of people in the 1840s to begin writing down their ideas about what society should look like. And essentially that Carl should take credit for this. And we'll talk more later who these people were. But generally speaking, in 1848, Karl Marx wrote a book known as the Communist Manifesto. And in it, by the way, it's a very, very short book if you're ever inclined to read it. I just forewarned it. It is a general flaming bucket of whack. But in it, Marx described what we would generally call communism. And his ideas boiled down to this: all of life is a struggle between two groups, a group of victims and an oppressor group. The oppressors are known as the bourgeois. It's where we get the current slang term bougie or bougie. The bourgeois are the capitalist business owners, the wealthy elite, the holders of wealth who themselves produce nothing and do nothing. They simply are the recipients of money. Against that, the victim group are the proletariat, the workers, specifically and especially industrial workers. We're not talking about skilled labor. We're talking about general, meaning the manual laborers. And eventually, what will happen is the proletariat, who outnumber the bourgeois enormously, will come to realize that they are being oppressed. In order to make the bourgeois happy, or to make the proletariat happy, the bourgeois will eventually sort of give in and compromise to bestow some kind of democracy, which will eventually lead to the proletariat, the majority, overthrowing the bourgeois and establishing a new form of government after this revolution. This government will be in complete control of the economy in all aspects of production and all aspects of wealth. They will distribute to the vast majority of people what they need. There will be no private property, no private ownership. The government controls and provides for everything. Now, because there is a government, that government will be a small group of people. And this is where things get a little bit cloudy and squirrely. Much of Marx's ideas were backed up with the science of his day, and that science was specifically Darwinian evolution. The idea that all things change and grow, and that nature itself is a struggle of survival, and that only the strong survive. This group of leaders are a special group of people who, sort of evolution wise, are just meant to be in charge. They are the ones who are better suited to that being in charge. Now, if you have never really had the pleasure of reading Darwin, I will summarize it very simply. Human beings, according to Charles Darwin, all descended from apes and monkeys. But like there are different kinds of apes and monkeys, there's different kinds of humans. Or maybe I shouldn't, because there's different kinds of humans, there's different kinds of apes and monkeys that they descended from. So realistically, what this boils down to is certain apes and monkeys are superior to others. And you can tell that certain humans are superior to others. And so you can know that those superior humans came from superior monkeys. And they are entitled to rule because they are the biggest, best, strongest monkeys who have evolved into the biggest, best, strongest humans. How do you tell the difference looking at a person, what kind of monkey they came from? Well, generally speaking, it's very simple. You can look at skin pigmentation, and the lighter the skin pigment, the better the monkey that they came from. This was Darwinian science at its highest form. This is Karl Marx as well. The people who are meant to be in control, this special group of people, are meant to be that way because they're superior to everybody else. And the inferior people will naturally die off, not be allowed to reproduce, and you'll kind of cull the herd that way. Now, eventually, you will achieve a hippie kumbaya where everybody has, there is no private property, no private ownership. Everybody has everything in common, where the government, these special people, distribute all the wealth. Um, a lot of Marxism is very racist at its heart, even though people don't understand that. Karl Marx was a flaming racist who had no use for people of ethnicity other than his own, and who felt that the new burgeoning society would purge itself of the undesirable elements. Now, in addition to this, Marx is an atheist. He actually wrote a lot of poetry, and if you read it, he had a weird obsession with the devil, bordering on like sort of a cult like worship of the devil. It's really kind of messed up. But Marx's view was is that religion was created and invented by the bourgeois capitalist to control the proletariat by making them believe that they were actually better off because God truly loved the poor, the oppressed, and the victim more than he did the wealthy and the privileged. In fact, it's an inverse. Religion specifically taught that the worse off you were, the more that God loved you. So therefore, it was actually better to be worse off than it was to be one of the bourgeois. This is why the bourgeois created religion. And who were these bourgeois business owners? Well, interestingly enough, the wealthy capitalists, the wealthy bankers, the wealthy everybody almost all happened to be Jewish. So really, it was a struggle of the oppressed workers who were genetically superior to the owners who were Jews. Wow, is that kind of odd that you would hear Germans talking about the Jews oppressing them and the need to overthrow them and take away wealth from them? That's really an interesting idea. Hmm. Yeah. So this is at its heart Marxism. All of life is a struggle. The bourgeois are the owners, the oppressors, the proletariat are the workers, the victims. Eventually, democracy will be established, which will lead to a revolution to overthrow the bourgeois and set up a new group of rulers who will control everything, hand out all the wealth, and provide for the needs of everybody. Um, when confronted with Marx's racism, with Marx's bizarre ideas, with um, his kookiness, most leftists will say that nobody really truly understands Marx. That's why everybody gives Marx a bad rap. Um, I think that that's probably not correct, but that's Marx and his ideas in a nutshell. Oh, and by the way, Karl Marx, who wrote many books, advocated the violent overthrow of rulers through the establishment of democracy and then sort of a violence that outgrows of democracy where this majority of people who are oppressed will violently overthrow this minority and take from them what it is that they need. And um, one of the other interesting things to keep in mind is that he wrote all these books while he was in exile, living a cushy life in England, where wealthy capitalist business owners were paying all of his bills and providing for all of his needs and for the needs of his family. So you can just ponder that and let that sink in. I'll try to find a little maybe like Marxism in a nutshell video for you that I can put up. Uh, but overall, a lot of what he says is just pretty much hokum and bunk. Now, he did not invent this, but he did popularize it. Now, one other thing of why we're talking about a whack job German guy in American history. Well, partly to support himself and add on to his own personal wealth, even though he didn't believe we should actually have private wealth and private property. Marx was a journalist who reported on business labor relations in Europe for American newspapers. And we're not talking about like publishing in like the Waukesha Freeman or something small. He was published in major newspapers all around the country. And all of his stories involving what was going on between business and ownership were written from the viewpoint of this class struggle between the bourgeois and the proletariat, spreading his ideas in America through use of the media. And therefore, Americans became very sort of familiar with Marx's views and the way that he viewed everything. And they began to accept this as possibly an explanation for how stuff was going on, which this use of the media feeds very well into our next guy. This is Friedrich Nietzsche. Um, so, Friedrich Nietzsche, now notice the epic mustache on this man, is one of the great thinkers of the political right. And I think, ironically enough, many of them would not admit to being this way, but these are some of the basics of Nietzsche's principles. Nietzsche lived at a time where, and notice, he and Marx were contemporaries. They lived around the same time period as each other. Nietzsche's belief was that the media and popular culture in general were all bad because they were used to create mediocrity. That was just like blah. It didn't make you special, it just made you blah. You went along with what everybody else wanted. You sort of like what everybody told you was the thing you should be doing is what you did. It produced ignorance, people who were unaware of the truth. And unlike Marx, it involved a lot about religion. Religion made people weak. Why? Because religion, specifically Christianity, was made up by people to justify their own failures. Why am I poor? Because God really loves poor people. Why am I unsuccessful? Well, it's because I'm humble. Why am I, you know, why am I not with somebody who would make me happy? Because all right, the gym is closed. Sorry for that interruption. Um, why am I not happier in my married life? Because religion teaches you to be happy and to go after monogamy and a single family relationship and to establish um, like roles for um, that you can only be married to one person. You have to be happy with those relationships between men and women. When in actuality, it shouldn't be that way. And who created all this? Well, Christians created this to make themselves feel better because in reality, Christians were very weak, mediocre people who just tried to sort of like mull along and make an excuse for why their lives were bad. And who invented Christianity? Well, actually, it was the Jews to try to prevent Christians from being better, and Christians just kind of adopted this for themselves. Wow, notice again a German targeting the Jews. What Nietzsche believed was, however, in something called the Übermensch or the Superman. Because unlike Karl Marx, whose everything involved the group mentality, specifically that there were groups of people, remember, the struggle between the large group of people and the small group of people, Nietzsche's the exact opposite. Everything's about the individual, the small group of people. We don't work to be all the same. We don't work for people to be equal. We don't work for people to be happy and given what they want. The real true individual, the Superman, which is what Übermensch means, takes what he wants. He has the individual willpower. He has the individual determination, the individual tenacity to seize what he wants, to take power. The Superman doesn't just marry some woman, he takes any woman he wants. And when he finds the right women, they produce super babies. They produce a new race of people. They rise above this culture of like blah to make a brand new super culture, a super culture that doesn't need religion because religion is weakness. The new super culture is about achievement. It is about individuality and uniqueness. It is about true knowledge. Yes, sometimes this makes you lonely. Sometimes this makes you the outsider, but that's okay because why should you settle for less? Instead, you as the individual should seize power and be God and be the one who dictates everything. Now, what does this mean about government? For the most part, government supports this media and culture that produces this blah. What you need to do is create your own culture where you spread the truth amongst all the people who are worthy of it. Who are these people? They're the supermen like you who do not think like the group does, who do not need the group to tell you anything, who truly sees what belongs to you. Now, interestingly enough, you'll notice there's a lot of similarity between Marx's thoughts and Nietzsche's thoughts, but some of the ways that they sort of differ from each other. For Nietzsche, the government was a group of elites who provided for everybody and that there was no private ownership of property. For Nietzsche, unlike Marx, government is essentially the individual who seizes what they want. So it's natural that some people have more why because they are capable of it. For Marx, it went back to the Darwinian idea of survival of the fittest, and some people are meant to rule as a group over the lesser people. For Nietzsche, the Superman, the person who is meant to rule, eliminates the rest and rules over those who are left, exploiting them because he can. It's essentially the same argument, except one makes it seem like the wealthy elite who end up out of this will just share the wealth for everybody. And for Nietzsche, they take the power to themselves, and the weak are left over who will do their bidding. It's the same argument. It's just one approaches it from the aspect of the individual, one approaches it from the aspect of the group. Nietzsche died very unhappy and very lonely, but consoling himself with the fact that he was the Superman that he talked about. Both of these philosophies have a lot of impact on future European society, particularly on German society. The interesting thing to note about Nietzsche, however, is that his views about the individual and the creation of this idea of a Superman really impact American scientific thinking, particularly the concept of the idea of this survival of the fittest in terms of um, those who should be allowed to be wealthy and powerful. And it's kind of terrifying the long term ramifications of that. So you have your two philosophers, the great philosopher of the left, the great philosopher of the right, and sort of what they do. Now, there's other people too, but I just picked these two out because it's super simple. Now, all of these sort of beg the question of these are the two absolute extremes, and they're both whack jobs to the extreme. But what actually is best for people? What gives you the best opportunity to succeed? Now, you will also notice that both of these philosophers are well after the founding of America. That's because Americans did not use either of these ideas when they founded the country. What's scary is in the late 19th century, the time period we're looking at after the Civil War, is when both of those men, when Marx and Nietzsche wrote, and their ideas began really popularizing themselves in American thought. America itself was founded on the idea of inalienable rights, this idea that there are certain rights from God that you cannot take away. Now, for Marx, there is no God, and therefore rights come from the government, and we give them, we can take them away if we're the government. For Nietzsche, there is no God. Rights belong to you because you take them, and therefore, if people lose their rights, is because they're too weak to defend them. The Constitution enshrines this idea in both the statement and the preamble, the 6 points or the six ideas of government, as well as the Bill of Rights, making sure that people are aware that there are rights that are like spelled out for them. The sticky wicket comes in again in this question of how do you best promote the general welfare? What is the best way to achieve this for people? Now, you could go the groupthink idea, which is democracy, or you could go into a more individualistic idea, which is sort of like embodied in republicanism. You could do a limited government where the government has very restricted powers, or you could do a very authoritarian government where the government was in charge of everything, which was an idea about it from a man named Thomas Hobbes, who had the inalienable rights, but then said you had to give them up to an authoritarian government. And economics, what economy is going to work best to provide and ensure these inalienable rights and to promote the general welfare and to ensure the best for all people? Is it going to be a free market where like there's as little regulation as possible, or a command market where the government is in charge of everything? That's communism. So there is the ultimate question as well as of property. Now, here's the interesting thing. The founders all maintained that the right of private property was essential for human beings and their happiness, which is definitively not Marxist, where there is no private property or ownership. Yet they reject Nietzsche's later assumption that private property only exists when you can hold on to it. So where is the best opportunity? Well, that's what we're going to talk about later when we talk about the philosopher who did the most impact the founders. That was a Scottish philosopher, not German, named Adam Smith. We'll talk about him later. And yes, we read about him. Peace and love.